Good vach, everybody. It's Sunday morning, the 20th of November, and we are continuing dropping all these sneak previews to the XLerate series. As I mentioned already twice at least, this series is going to be officially starting in February because people have complained that they already have their schedule set until the new semester, and they would want to incorporate it into their timetable for the spring semester. So we're starting in February after the midwinter break. It'll coincide with our having just finished our major wine tasting event, which is being advertised heavily on our site. Go there now to get your early bird specials. But between now and February, we're still going to just drop these videos to get ahead of ourselves. Why not? So if everyone could get a head start on the program before it officially starts, why not? Now, I may have misspoke in an earlier session about it being pushed off to December. It was I meant February. I meant the new semester. So our wine event is February 5th. So we're talking about about sometime February 6th onwards is when we're officially going to get started. But between now and then, we're going to still be stacking up so you could get you get a head start. Why not? Anyways, so let us now continue our discussion. This particular video that I'm making right now is a continuation of the course on XLerate called Structure of Torah in Historical Context. The last two sessions before the one I'm recording right now, we dealt with the structure of the Torah Shebechsav, the written law, and now I'm here to pick up a few things we still need to clarify before we start Be'ez Hashem with the next video on this series, where we start discussing the structure of the Torah Sheba'al Peh in historical context. Okay, we are up to Kesuvim. We had defined Nevi'im and the difference between Nevi'im and Chumash, the difference between Torah, the 5 books of Moshe, and Nevi'im, and why Torah actually paved the way for Nevi'im. Prior to Moshe Rabbeinu, any Torah that, let's say, Avram Avinu figured out, like Sefer Yetzirah, could not be a book. Sefer Yetzirah, which is attributed to Avram Avinu, is Torah Sheba'al Peh, and we explained that in the first out of the last two videos, explaining what changed with Moshe. Revelation, divine revelation, not just wisdom, revelation, and that's what the books of the Tanakh represent, revelation. All right. I'm not going to recap everything we said. You have to review. You got to go back to those previous videos if you are not sure about what I'm saying. Anyway, so now we are up to Kesuvim. Now, Kesuvim is written, on a lower level of prophecy than Nevi'im. No one is on the level of Moshe's prophecy other than Moshe himself, and it was with that prophecy that Torah was written. The 5 books of Moshe were written with his supreme level of prophecy. All right? And we're going to come back to that, later in this session. It's very important. And you'll see why. All right, so now the 5 books of Moshe written by his supreme level of prophecy, and that's the special status of the 5 books of Moshe. Right? And it makes also not just special status, but special halachic status that we have discussed in earlier videos. All right, so now the books of Nevi'im were written by the other levels of prophecy of anyone other than Moshe, but they are levels of prophecy. No 2 prophets are exactly on the exact same level, but they're in the same general category. And now we come to Kesuvim, which is, a downgrade, right? And it is not the same level of prophecy. And that's why you'll see a very interesting style. The Kesuvim don't say, Ko Amar Hashem, so said Hashem. The prophet's not speaking in the name of God. He's writing what seems to sound like wisdom, right? Seemingly his own wisdom. he'll mention God, but he's not going to say, God sent me to tell you this, right? It's wisdom. And sometimes it looks so far away from prophecy. It can be very deceptive, like the book of Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, right? Which is if not for the fact that Chazal interpreted for us, it looks like a love story. It's actually love poems, can't help commenting that it would not sell well as love poems because you're telling your beloved that she has teeth like goats or stuff like that. There's like that. It is so clear, it is so transparent that it's all allegory. Because to take it at face value is, say that stuff to a woman, she'd slap you. That's what Chazal say. Shir Hashem is Kodesh, Kadosh, the holiest of holies. I remember this is written in books, but when I was a little boy, and my father, every once in a while, used to take me to Washington Heights for Shabbos. And Rav Shimon Schwab was the Rav then. It's one of the few times I heard Rav Shimon Schwab speak. I heard him a handful of times in the course of my youth. And I remember it was brothers speaking between Mincha and Marav on a Shabbos afternoon, as Shabbos Koyan, and he said, why Shir Hashem is called Kodesh Kadoshim? The idea is in the Sforim, but he just said it so nicely in a way that made an impression on a very young boy. I don't even know if I was bar mitzvah yet. And he said, because, the holier something is, the more removed it is. Right? So now the very fact that, the Kisvei HaKodesh, which are holy, they're from prophecy or divine inspiration we're going to discuss, but, at least they have a simple meaning, which makes them a little bit more accessible. More accessible is the opposite of holy, because Kodesh, the word Kodesh, holiness, literally in Hebrew means removed. This is beyond. So having a simple pshat that is relatable, that you can get some ideas from, useful ideas. All right, so it's still from the divine, so it's holy. It came from a higher place. But, Shir Hashem is Kodesh, the holy, so because there's nothing you could get from the simple reading of the words. Right, there's no outer layer to it, so it's the holiest. It's removed, totally removed, and there is no way to decode it if not for what Chazal explained to us it means. Right, so okay, but the point is that Shir Hashem, as much as it's a little bit extreme, in how it doesn't sound like conventional prophecy, right? But that's the general tone of all the books of Kesuvim, like the Book of Ruth. Right, it's the story of Ruth, nothing that makes it sound like, if not that we know on the authority of the Anshe Kesed, who decided to put it in the canon of the written law, we've never thought it's prophetic. Right? So there's all the story of Ruth, the Book of Esther. Right, so even though now Shlomo Melch's other books, Mishlei, Koheles. It's all wisdom, right? And even Daniel, from what I can tell, it seems like the most, closest thing where you have prophecy, but Kesuvim is Daniel, because he does record his visions there, but his visions are not on the level of the other prophets. That's what the Gemara says. That, when the Gemara says when Daniel was with Chag Yischar and Malachi, he saw what was causing everyone to tremble. They couldn't see it. So Gemara says he is better than them. They are better than him. He is better than them. He saw, they didn't see. But they're better than him because they're prophets and he isn't. Even though he had visions, and that's what we're coming to explain. He had visions, but he's not on their level of prophecy. Chag Yischar Malachi, their books are part of Nevi'im, not Kesuvim. They're part of the Treasar, which is part of Nevi'im. It's prophecies, right? He wasn't a prophet. He had divine inspiration. So, but it's like the closest thing to that of Kesuvim that would make it resemble Nevi'im. Offhand, I may need to be corrected on this, but offhand, the Book of Daniel, because he records his visions, right? Right, but the Gemara clearly states he is not on the level of Nevi'im. Right, he's not on the level of Chag Yischar and Malachi, who are bona fide Nevi'im. right? And and what they wrote is in the Nevi'im section. What he wrote is in the Kesuvim section. But other than Daniel's visions, generally speaking, if I need to be corrected, please correct me. But generally speaking, it's like Shir Hashem, Koheles, Ruach, Esther, Eov, Echa. These don't sound like prophecies. These are people either lamenting, complaining, having philosophical discussions, philosophical debates. Right? There's no messenger coming in the name of God to tell us, and so said Hashem. Right? More often than not. Right? All right, so it's written on a level called Ruach HaKodesh. But of course, Ruach HaKodesh is a very general term, as Ramchal points out in the Derech Hashem. And the Rambam also dealt with it in a few places in the Moreh Nevuchim, including in the very beginning in the Akdama. They discussed it also again in the second section. Listen, Ruach HaKodesh is a term that we use extremely broadly, right? So there's a level of Ruach HaKodesh that it's like almost, it's really borders on full-blown prophecy, hence that level in which Kesuvim was written. It's still enough of a divine revelation that, real divine revelation, that it could be Torah Shebechsav, right? It'll fit into the concept of, so it's not Nevuah Maush, it's Ruach HaKodesh, but it borders on Nevuah, and of course the wisdom there is Nevuah Shehutzachol Dors, has a timeless message, and it makes it into Torah Shebechsav. That's one level of Ruach HaKodesh where we try to differentiate it from full-blown prophecy, right? But then there's also, when we use Ruach HaKodesh, very broadly speaking, that the person has augmented intelligence because he's so spiritual. So his spirituality and his neshama that shines bright within his body augments his intelligence. And that's what we say a lot of, he has Ruach HaKodesh, or this was said Ruach HaKodesh. People have said, right, about Rashi on Chumash, that it was written Baruch HaKodesh. I even heard that from my Rebbe, Yaakov Weinberg, written Baruch HaKodesh. Doesn't make it Torah B'chsav. This is where he had special divine assistance, special augmented intelligence to produce such a book like Rashi and Chumash that could be learned on so many different levels. Look at all the Mefarshim there are on Rashi on Chumash, right? And they're still being more real Mefarshim, not just to translate it, but there are those that tackle it from a halachic standpoint. Those tackle it from an allegorical standpoint. There are those that tackle it from what forced him to say what he's saying. It's amazing, right? Rashi on Chumash, in the words of my Rebbe, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, Rashi on Nach. It's very interesting. Rashi on Nevi'im and Kesuvim, right, is the work of a genius. Rashi on Chumash is the work of a Baal Ruach HaKodesh. Because it's an amazing book, it's not Torah B'chsav. It's an amazing work, right? That it's the many Meforshim on, and how the Sifrei Chasidus also superimpose a lot of their ideas on Rashi and Chumash. It's amazing, But that was called, we mean Ruach HaKodesh, augmented intelligence, special divine assistance to produce a work, as it were, bigger than himself, for lack of a better way of saying it. But and certainly if someone has some great ideas, and he plumbs the depth of Torah. So you say it was said Baruch HaKodesh, but we don't mean prophecy. We mean augmented intelligence. But by Kesuvim, we mean it Ruach HaKodesh per se, that it's a certain level right beneath real prophecy. Right? It is truly, in the literal sense, divinely inspired, right? As opposed to, we call divinely inspired, but we mean augmented intelligence because of spiritual energy. This is like really divinely inspired. Okay, and that's what Kesuvim is. Now, here's the amazing thing: there is no historical order to this. Right? We mentioned Shlomo, right? Shlomo's books are all Kesuvim, right? Yemishle, Shir Hashirim, Koheles, right? These are Kesuvim. And he is pretty early on in our history. He is David HaMelech's son. Lived considerably before Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, who are Nevi'im, right? So it comes out now that that's not to any shortcoming in Shlomo's level, as we're going to demonstrate, right? The difference between Nevi'im and Kesuvim is not a historical difference that is early in history, that is later in history. Not at all. It's what level of prophecy was written with. The level of Nevuah per se, and its Nevuah Shutz Chodors becomes Nevuah. When it's written on the level called Ruach HaKodesh, which we mean unmitigated divine inspiration, as opposed to augmented intelligence. That's right. I'm trying to dispel the confusion because sometimes we use the term Ruach HaKodesh too broadly, but that's what we do. We've been doing it for many generations, right? But there's like Ruach HaKodesh per se is a certain level of divine revelation. It's a certain level of revelation. It's just not the same level as prophecy. And so a book written with that level, it's still enough of a divine revelation to merit being the Torah Shebechsav, right? But it's not Nevi'im, it's Kesuvim. Okay, so now here's the thing, So Shlomo Melech may have been, as big as Yeshayahu Yirmiyahu. He was one of the wisest men ever lived. But these books happen to have been written with Ruach HaKodesh and not with Nevuah. And this goes through Shmuel. So the book of Shmuel is Nevi'im. Shmuel wrote Ruth. Right, so Shmuel is a Navi, and his prophecies and his adventures are in the book of Shmuel, right? But he wrote Rus, which is Kesuvim, because listen, that was the level of of divine revelation he had when writing that book. Yirmiyahu, a Navi, right, right? Sefer Yirmiyahu, right? He wrote Eicha. Eicha's from Kesuvim. Right, because that was at the level they was on, when composing that book. I mean, the content of that book came from that level called Ruach HaKodesh, as opposed to what we call Nevuah. Right? And now it goes even further. Moshe, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, greatest prophet, and only he could write a book like Chumash, and no one could ever reach that level, right? The supreme master prophet. So according to some opinions, he's the one who wrote Eov, a philosophical book about, the story of Eov, and he was seemingly tortured for no reason, seemingly, right? Seemingly, and he debates with his friends. It's there is an opinion he's the one who wrote it, right? And it's Kesuvim. Right, because when he wrote that book, he had revelation on that level. Not revelation on the level of his supreme prophecy. Right? So that's why it doesn't have the same kedusha as Chumash, same standing as Chumash, even though it was written by the same guy who wrote Chumash. Right? He wasn't on that level when he wrote that book, according to opinion that he's the one who wrote Eov. Right? So it's not a matter of, even though we're talking about historical context, but it's not an issue of history of what's in Nevi'im and what's in Kesuvim. It's an issue of what level of revelation was there at the time. Okay, that's a very important point. Okay, so now before I go back, because it's such a powerful thing, so I'm saving something about the Book of Esther for the end, right? But we did speak about why Esther fought so badly, to be included in the Torah Shebechsav. Initially, the Anshe Gazal did not want her book to be part of the Tanakh, and I refer you back to I think it was the first session of the previous two that we addressed that, and I'm going to revisit it today. All right, so but generally speaking, both Nevi'im and Kesuvim, like we mentioned, they're not coming to teach us halacha, right? We could use them to draw hints about historically what Jews did, right? We could use it as a dictionary of Gilui Milsa Ba'alma, right? So either we use it for its historical record, like the Kinyan Chalipin is chronicled in the Book of Rus, right? But it's not the source for Kinyan Chalipin, as far as I know. It's it shows as the Paul says, it's also famous. So this was the tradition. I used to do kinyan chalipin. Right? It's the historical record that this was a accepted Jewish form of transaction, to make a kinyan. That is my understanding. If someone has heard otherwise, I'd like to hear it. Right? Generally, because divrei halacha v'divrei kabbalah lo yofinan. If that's true about Nevi'im, it's certainly true about Kesuvim. Right? But it is a historical record for the practice. Right? And then there's also Gilui Milsa Ba'alma, like we use the story of Tzidkiyo ben Kanana in Malachim, I believe it is, right, to shed light on what's called Tagor, that Tagor is not just with horns that are attached. If a bull will take detached horns in its mouth and go on a rampage that way, it's also called Nagicha, right? Gilui Milsa Ba'alma, right? So the question goes back, and we explained why, because there's two different principles, and it's beyond the scope. It's a good lumdus, really good lumdus to understand, the difference between Elam mitzvah, a Navi Rosh Hashanah. These are the mitzvahs. Navi cannot say anything new, and there's also Lo Bashamayim. You just can't use anything heavenly. Moshe was the one and only exception in history, right? He was the only one licensed on his supreme level of prophecy, on that level of which Chumash was written, to ask God questions and bring down Torah from Shemaim. After Moshe's Lo Bashamayim, it's already on earth. And everyone, and the words of the Rambam in his Hakdam Rizroim, even Yoshua and Pinchas that were there at the time of the giving of the Torah, they grew up under Moshe Rabbeinu. Still, they have to do the same thing as Ravina and Ravashi, and they have to interpret the law with the Midah Shaton Dreshbam and argumentation, like the whole Shakavatari of the Gemara, right? To resolve any question that they have, or to create new halacha. Right? They cannot use prophecy. That's it. It's sealed. All right. So now, like I said, it's an issue. I know. I once saw that Meshulem David Soloveitchik's Bracha had shirim on this. What's this between Elam mitzvahs and Lo Bashamayim? What does one teach that the other doesn't? Right. It seems to me from the Rambam that the Rambam just went with Lo Bashamayim and took it as a blanket clause, but to cover all bases. That's what we can't use, prophecy or divine inspiration in Jewish law at all. Now that the Rambam says what he does, using it in Jewish law, he spells out Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, that a Navi that will tell you God said this is the halacha, or God said halacha is like Beis Hill, not like Beis Shammai, Navi Sheker. It is impossible. If he says that God told me to tell you that, he's a false prophet, because God would not send him with such a prophecy. Okay. All right. Absolutely not. But the Rambam says even something, beyond that, which he wrote earlier in life in his commentary on the Mishnah. That he says that the Nevuas and Navi lo Torah b'Pirushei Torah, right? That the prophet's prophecy won't even help him in just interpreting the law, which seems to be like a much broader category, not just in halacha, but even to say pshat and pasuk, right? So now let's quickly zoom back to what we said about Rashi on the Torah, the name of Yaakov Weinberg, who was a Talmud of the Rambam, Now that I'm going to say a special anecdote, which I think is lavish praise, depending on how you look at it. Right, it was well known. It could be that that my Rosh Yeshiva of Yaakov Weinberg and Rosh Yeshiva of Philadelphia of Elliot Tzvei, both Zichronam Livracha, both Nucham Eden, and now I'm sure they're the best of friends up there, right? But here on earth, they had a lot of differences of opinion. A lot of really. Sometimes it was pretty sharp. That's the way it is between Jews. They're all Jews, right? But I have to say, there was a Tversky who was a Rav in Chicago that being a Rav in Chicago, he was very involved in Kiruv over the years, and Rav Yaakov Weinberg used to paskin a lot of shouts for the Kiruv community, those engaged in Kiruv and questions that Bali Tshuva had. So, of course, he was in close contact with my Rosh Rav Yaakov Weinberg, who was considered to be the big paisik for Inyane Kiruv. But he himself, this Hasidic guy, the Stramo, was a Philadelphia Talmud. He was an alumnus of Philly, really, back in the old days when they had the All-Stars there. And then, of course, he learned by Rebellia Svei also. And, he stayed in contact with his Rabbeim in Philly. And he once asked, his Rosh Yeshiva, Rebellia Svei, what is it between you and Rav Yaakov Weinberg? And this is what he said. And I, I personally view it as lavish praise. And he said as follows: Ich bin a Talmud von der Rambam durch the Goyen. I follow the Rambam. I'm a Talmud of the Rambam, but through the Vilna Gaon. I follow, through the filter of all the generations in between, of which, the Lithuanian world that Rebellia Tzvei identified with, the big spiritual patriarch of the Lithuanian world, and the way we learn, the Litzvisha Derech Halim is the Goyen. Right? So ich bin a Talmud durch the Goyen. Right? I am a Talmud of the Rambam through the Vilna Gaon. Right? Ech is a Talmud from the Rambam direct. That's how he said it. He is a Talmud direct from Rambam, which, as if he cut out the whole Masorah in between, tried to go directly back to the Rambam. I can understand the contention, but that doesn't sound like, that doesn't sound too bad. Anyways, and as I'm saying it, I'm reminded of something that the Rambam himself wrote to Rav Ovadia Ager. He had a correspondence with, a Ger Tzedek, Rav Ovadia, and he wrote him a tshuva about the laws that pertain to him, as a Ger, and some of the special halachas that he may have. And he said a Ger should not think that he came from, his biological parents were Goyim, so he's like, on a low level. He shouldn't say that, right? A Ger is a direct descendant, a direct child of Avram Avinu. You're Ben Avram. That's how you call Torah. You're Ben Avram. You are directly a son of Avram Avinu. As a guy born Jewish, there's a lot of simple people in between. I don't know as I'm telling over that story of, Rebellia Tzvei and what he said about my Rosh Yeshiva, kind of remember about that, reminded of that Rambam. So he said, well, Rav Yaakov Weinberg tries to be a Talmud of the Rambam directly, right? Bypassing okay. It somehow just rings familiar to what the Rambam said about to Rav Ovadia Ger. The Ger bypasses all the generations and is directly a son of Avram Avinu. All right. Anyways, forgive me for engaging in some nostalgia, but for people into the history of the yeshiva world and yeshiva politics, this is gold. Right? You can't get this anywhere else. Anyways, back to our topic. Right, so Rav Yaakov Weinberg, a Talmud from the Rambam direct, or a big Rambamist, said Rashi al Chumash is a work of a Baal Ruach HaKodesh, right? Now, what do you mean by that, right? It's like we said before, when your intelligence is augmented by the power of the neshama or spiritual energy, but it's still your mind, just it's being juiced up, that's fine. So I could believe Ravina or Ravashi had Ruach HaKodesh in the broad sense, they had augmented intelligence, but it's still it's coming in Orach Seichel, to quote from the Zohar, by the way, that the Zohar said, we have revelation, right? The people that wrote the Zohar, but it's Orach Seichel, it says in Tikkunei Zohar, but it's in the manner that it comes in the guise of intellect, right? Okay, so that's fine, because that's how Torah is meant to be deciphered, with human intellect, lo bashamaymi. If that human intellect is augmented, juiced up, it's fine, but it's coming in that guise, through that vehicle, right? As opposed to Kesuvim, they're written like this was a form of revelation, right? So even though it sounds like wisdom, the way the Kesuvim are written, but it was a level of revelation. Right? That's why it became Torah Shebachsav. Right? But revelation also cannot be used to interpret the Torah. Right? The Rambam says not even just not to cite halacha, but even to interpret the Torah not. Right? So sounds even like to say a pshat and pasuk, but that's revelation. Right? But if you're using your head, right, but your neshama is sparking in your head, and there's like tremendous, you're tapped in, and there's like tremendous divine energy augmenting your intelligence. That's fine, because at the end, the vehicle is the mind. The vehicle is the mind. So if it's augmented, that's fine, right? As long as that's the vehicle, it's coming ba'orach seichel, and the Zohar says in the Quran Zohar, it's coming ba'orach seichel in a way, in the guise of sichlius, of intellect, right? Okay, so what are the Nevi'im and Kesuvim for? They're for Musar. We explained. They just reinforced it. They were sent by God to double down on keeping the Torah, and all the wisdom that there is in the Nevi'im and Kesuvim you could find in the Chumash, right? So and we're going to get back to this. I asked my Rosh Yeshiva, therefore, as I said in an earlier video. So if I just learn a lot of Musar, can I not learn the Nevi'im and Kesuvim? They said, well, that's a silly thing to say. Are you saying that as great as the Rishonim and Achronim who wrote Musar Sfarim were, you say they did a better job than the Nevi'im? Please, right? Give me a break. All right, but we're going to come back to this, right? It's really for Musar, and then the Nevi'im just spelled out everything, things that are already encoded in the Chumash of Moshe Rabbeinu or in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? They just spelled it out and they doubled down on it and screamed at us to remember these things and to be careful to keep them, right? So they just they didn't say anything new. They are doubling. They're either spelling out or doubling down, right? Okay, but now we're talking about using them like we have a doubt. We want to resolve the doubt. What do we do? So here's the classical question that everyone has to deal with. Right. We know that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, they splintered to two schools of thought. Right. And the we didn't know whether to follow Beis Shammai until a Baskel came out. A Baskel rang out and said, Elu v'Dochaim, they're both speaking, they're both academically true. They're both equally academically valid, right? But Halacha k'divrei Beis Hillel, but Halacha's like Beis Hillel. And, there's the Baskel. So now, indeed, in some places in Shas, it says, well, this wouldn't work according to Rabbi Yeshua. And it's clear that the Rambam passes like Rabbi Yeshua, lo bashamaymi, right? It wouldn't work like Rabbi Yeshua, right? But the word, the Baskel was like a game changer. All right, so on this, there's a Tosfos, right, which says, well, look, the truth is like this. The Halacha should have been like Beis Hillel anyway. You know why? Because there were more of them than Beis Shammai. There was more of them than Beis Shammai. Right? That should have been the Halacha anyway. But we had a suffix, right? Because Beis Shammai were machadedi tfei, right? They were sharper. Right? So maybe we thought maybe the going with the majority just doesn't apply, because if the minority are sharper than the majority, maybe. So Baskel really was just reinforcing, as it were, doubling down on the idea of going basar roiv, going with the most, going with the majority. It was doubling down on what was the truth anyway. So the question is how to understand this Tosfos. Right, and this Tosfos may have been transcribed differently, in different places. Right, so the question is, we could rely on it if it's based. Now, the easiest way to say it that we should get into is that the Baskel was just giving us the confidence to go with what we knew was the right thing anyway. So it's not called that really, decided the issue. It's not called that, saying anything new. It could also be read that tells us that that which you don't go with Baskol, right? You don't go with Baskol. That's only if it's against halacha. We was going with halacha, right? Very subtle, but and the question is how you want to read that. Tosfos opens up an issue of whether it could play a role ever, or was just specific to this case. That it doesn't say that it's really not really making up or really not deciding anything. The halacha was supposed to be based on anyway. How do you read that Tosfos? And are all the Balei Tosfos that's ascribed to school thought, are they really exactly on the same page? Now, so we are Rambam people. I said this many times that we're in this series we go with the Rambam. Now it seems to me the straightest way in the Rambam, straightest understanding is that he passes the halachas like Rabbi Yeshua, lo b'shamayim he, and I don't think according to the Rambam, they really needed the baskol at all. But it would come out, it would sound like that the Rambam would have to concede that there might be other opinions that he doesn't paskin like, other opinions that allow you to use a baskol, allow you to use supernatural means under certain circumstances. The Rambam himself is a hardliner against it, a hardliner, right? But it seems because he paskins like Rabbi Yeshua, right? Now seemingly the halacha ought to be like Rabbi Yeshua because we have a case like it. What's Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Elazar ben Horkonos was arguing on all the chachamim, right? And then then he said he did a lot of tricks. If I'm right, then the river will flow backwards. The tree will uproot itself. And then he said the walls of the base medrash will fall, and even min hashamayim, and the Baskelman said malachem etzelazu halacha kamosu b'chol makom. And Rabbi Yeshua got up and said lo b'shamayim. But also over there, the principle of Tosfos holds up because it was Rabbi Elazar ben Horkonos against all the chachamim. Right? So lo b'shamayim he, because the shamayim was going against the halacha of achrei rabim lahatos, and this was a real achrei rabim lahatos because they heard him out and they still rejected everything he said. So they sat in one bezdin, they heard each other out, and they still rejected what he said. So Tosfos says, so now that's Rabbi Yeshua got the final word, right? And halacha is not like Rabbi Elazar ben Horkonos, right? Rabbi Yeshua got the final word. Halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua, but Tosfos is saying, but like in that case, where the baskol was going against halacha, right? So against the halacha of achrei rabim lahatos. But if the baskol is not going against halacha, but the baskol says, or what the prophecy, seemingly what the prophecy says, could be consistent with halacha, not against, well, why not go with it? That seems that's what Tosfos seems to hold. And it goes further than that. There was one of the Balei Tosfos from Yaakov Meroy's, Yaakov from Roy's, right, who wrote Shalos Utshuvos min hashamayim. This man addressed his questions directly to heaven. He did a Kabbalistic ritual called Shelas Chalom, a dream quest. And in the morning, he got a written response, or it fell in his mouth. It's showing very poetic Hebrew that the whoever he was communing, whatever force he was communing with, very poetic Hebrew answers his questions. And sometimes says, he wants to know, is halacha like the Rif or not? Is halacha like Rashi Rabbeinu Tam by Tefillin and the Baskol, not the the revelation, the tshuva min hashamayim, really cuts the din. So now they say, well, listen, he's not going against it. It's a legitimate, the halacha could be either way, and we just don't know which way to go. So why discount input from Shemayim? We discount input from Shemayim if it's against achrei rabim lahatos. It goes against the majority opinion. It goes against something else that has been, settled law. All right. That seems to be the approach of the Balei Tosfos. The Rambam doesn't hold that way. The Rambam does not hold that way. Now, interesting enough, we mentioned Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Everyone quotes this particular tshuva of the Shalos Utshuvos min hashamayim because it's a classic. That's by Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. Who's right? And it says, just like it's a machlokas on earth, it's a machlokas in heaven. I forget who takes whose side, right? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu says like one, and the Mesivta de Rakia, the Heavenly Academy, says like the other. It's a machlokas. It's an irreconcilable machlokas. It's a classic piece. Everyone quotes, which means there must have always been two, from the time of the giving of Torah, there are always two schools of thought. Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam are just continuing an argument that goes all the way back to since the giving of the Torah itself. And so it's even a debate in heaven. Even in heaven, where they learn Torah, the halacha is not like one or the other. It remains a machlokas. It's amazing stuff. So now, regard with the Rambam hold that you could use the Sefer Shas from the Shemaim, probably not. But to do, we are Rambam people, but to do justice, when the Mosarov Cook reprinted the Reuven Margolius edition, Reuven Margolius had a very long introduction discussing these issues and what the basis to rely on the book are. So take a look there. And the Chidah also in the Shem HaGedolim, when talking about the book, also gives a whole pilpul of how one could rely on it. But everyone would admit that the Rambam, who's a hard liner and paskins like the simple understanding of Rabbi Yeshua of Lo Bashamayim across the board, right? Hard to believe the Rambam would agree with this. It would agree with using it in any way, or it having even any academic value, because it's you're saying it's a position because of Ruach HaKodesh, not because of a proof from a pasuk here or something from there. Okay. So the Rambam would probably hold that the Baskel didn't mean nothing, and we decided to go with Beis Hillel. It was consensus. It wasn't the Baskel. Now, even if it was the Baskel, by the way, even if the Baskel is of halachic value and saying, you should go with Beis Hillel and not with Beis Shammai, let's say for reasons that Tosfos says, right? But it's a very important point. It still doesn't become settled halacha. It becomes settled halacha because the Jewish people accepted it. The Jews accepted to go like the Baskel. So it still becomes only settled law because Am Yisrael accepted it, just like we accepted the Mishnah, we accepted the Talmud, right? But our question is whether this is whether there's any substantive halachic, substance, it was whether the Baskel is even worth anything as far as interpreting the Torah or certainly inciting halacha. That is our question. Then after that still has to be ratified, right? The Ram will tell you, the halacha is like Beis Hillel because Am Yisrael ratified. The simple answer is that he's a hardliner, like Rabbi Yeshua's literal, without putting any limitations on Rabbi Yeshua's din of Lo Bashamayim. It's the simplest way to go in the Rambam. It's the pashtus of the Rambam. Okay. So you might ask, but what about Teku, Tishbi, Taretz, Kushos, V'ibayos, right? Eliyahu Navi, he comes, right, and he settles debates, and we say in the future he's going to come and answer all our questions, right? All the things left to suffix. All right, there's a few approaches to that. So, first of all, a lot of things that, Eliyahu Navi is not coming to clarify, but clarify Mitzias, right? Although that's not going to answer all the tekus, right? But many of the tekus are questions in Mitzias, right? Let's back up. Okay, there's like the lost object, or an object in contention in order to return to. We say So when Eliyahu comes and says, give it to this guy, not that guy, he's not saying halacha. He's saying Mitzias. This guy really owns it. This guy's a thief. Right, so right, is the issue of reality check. Or Eliyahu is going to come and say this guy is a Kohen, this one, and the Ram brings this halacha in Hilchos Malachim, in the part that the church censor took down. At the very end of Hilchos Malachim, Eliyahu is going to come and say, you're from this shevet, you're from that shevet. He's going to give a person a din of, being from this shevet. No, he's just identifying the person. This is your yichus, this is your yichus. It's Mitzias, right? Hey. All right, but it's not going to change the fact that there's some sveika dedina, real doubts in what the din is, right? So Eliyahu Navi is different because Eliyahu Navi never died, right? He's not an angel, right? When he comes down and he puts on a body, he's one of us. Obviously he's better than we are because he could easily, divest of that body. But he comes down. He is a mortal. Not mortal. He's immortal. But he comes down in human form. He is not an angel. Speaking. He makes the trips and he puts on a body. Remember, he took his body with him to heaven, right? He's not dead. That's why there's a famous shiurim from Rabbi Chana and others is Eshes Elyo. So after he went to heaven, is his wife a widow or not? Because he didn't really die. Yeah, famous Shiloh, right? Eshes Elyo. So there are those that posit Elyo and Navi, and that's why we find there's Gilui Elyo. He comes and he learns Torah with people. Well, he's a living person when he comes down. He's just a very refined living person that he doesn't have to put his body in the grave in order to go to heaven. But he comes down and he puts on a body, a very highly refined one, right? So there are those that say that. Right, Elyo Navi, so he could paskin because he's no less than any other rabbi when he appears, right? And by the way, you could argue with him. Right? So even when you say, okay, Elyo Navi is allowed to paskin because he puts on a body, but the only person you're not allowed to argue with in history is Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's only when he said a halacha in the name of God himself. Like he's the one Navi that could speak in the name of God, right? In halacha, right? And only when you and you cannot argue with him when he speaks, when the divine presence speaks through his mouth, right? So he's the one person you can't argue. But if Moshe Rabbeinu says his own chiddush, I have an idea. Look, this is not, I'm not saying this from prophecy in the name of God, and I'm the one guy in history that can, but I'm not right here. This is my own pshat. You can argue with him. You can argue with Moshe Rabbeinu if he's not speaking in the name of God. I mean, argue pshat in halacha. If he's not speaking in the name of God himself, he said, no, and Moshe Rabbeinu is not always speaking in the name of God. He's, like we said earlier in this very session, he wrote Eov on his non-supreme level. That's why Eov is in Kesuvim, right? According to that opinion, they wrote Eov, right? So he said something, a svara de nafshe, his own idea. You can argue with him. So you can argue with Elyo Navi. The only person in history is, infallible, right? Is Moshe when speaking in the name of God. When he's saying his own ideas, you can argue with him. I'm not saying it farewell because he's probably a lot smarter, right? But you could argue with him. And you could argue with Elyo Navi. You can argue with Elyo Navi. Just you're allowed to listen to Elyo Navi because he's and say, I don't want to hear it. Because Torah has to be learnt on earth, and you shouldn't get Torah from heaven. You're allowed to listen to, you're allowed to hear it, and still, he's only as good as his proof. And you can argue with him, right? And with this, I see this session is taking much longer than I thought. I hope we can wrap it up soon. But with this, we have to, argue, and hit back, for lack of a word, what Hasidim say, that the Vilna Gaon argued with the Arizal. Hasidim say this, even some very big ones, I don't want to mention names. The Vilna Gaon, we know, argued with the Arizal on certain things, right? And because he didn't believe all of it's from Elyo Navi, just a little bit of it. That's what's written somewhere. That's nonsense. You could argue with Elyo Navi, right? At the end of the day, even Elyo Navi was come from heaven. He's still only as good as his proofs. So if the Arizal learned it from Elyo Navi, you could argue with that. The only person you can't argue with is Moshe when speaking in the name of God. Period. So that's the one thing. That's the one thing you can't argue with. All right, so so it makes no difference if the Arizal learned with Elyo, which we explained. If Elyo, when he puts on a body, you have a great chavrusa, right? You're allowed to be makabel from him, right? And don't have to reject it out of hand that lo bashamayim, right? Right. So that's another thing. But then we're going to get to another point. All right. So this way, Eliyahu could help, but of course, and I stand by what I said. No one's infallible except Moshe speaking in the when speaking in the name of God only. When he says his own chidushim, you can argue with him, even Moshe, right? All right, but Eliyahu, and by the way, it's also as we come to this that you could argue with an angel also if you ever get into an argument with an angel, in how to learn up, all right? But we're going to come to another thing. Okay, so there's the Magidim, right? The Ramchal had Magidim. He had people that came to him from heaven, and the Arizal, he didn't just learn with Eliyahu. He used to make trips to the Masifta de Rakia. He had these amazing out-of-body experiences. Went to the heavenly academies and learned Torah in heaven, came back down, and, how is that legit? I mean, according to the Rambam. Listen, the Arizal is... the Arizal has no since Moshe Rabbeinu, no one had such an impact on Judaism than the Arizal. Of course, not saying anything new. He just revealed, what's all encoded there. He revealed what's encoded in the Zohar, which reveals what's encoded in the Torah of Moshe. Right? The Arizal had such an amazing influence on the whole Hasidic movement. If not for the Arizal, it wouldn't be Hasidus. We could go on and on and on. Okay, so now the Arizal, which was considered to be the final word in Kabbalah, right? And supposedly he said he knew all this stuff because he learned with Eliyahu. So Eliyahu, we said, Eliyahu might be different because he puts on a body when he comes down. So he had a great chavrusa, great Rebbe, which is totally legit. When Eliyahu comes down in body, he is an earth. He has the same halachic status as an earth dweller, according to some, anyway. According to some, right? It's one teretz, it's one derech, right? But there are certain occasions where that's clearly not the case, right? The Ari went to heaven, right? The Arizal went to heaven, right? His soul went to visit the yeshiva the Nevi'im, the yeshiva the Tanoim. Right, and there's Magidim, angels. These are angels, or these are people who are souls of the departed who do not come down in body like Eliyahu Hanavi does. Right? What's the answer? Right, the Magidim. Right, and even the Vilna Gaon didn't want to learn from Magidim, but in some place he says, Rav Chaim Volozhiner says that he still had these revelations, even though he didn't treasure them. He didn't like them. He more valued his own learning, but he still had them. And in a certain place says, Yaakov Avinu told me. Yaakov Avinu. Now, I know Yaakov Avinu lo meis, but I don't want to get into that, But let's say there are all the other angels, anyone except for Yaakov Avinu, someone would argue Yaakov Avinu lo meis. I don't know if that helps, but let's say, but they have the angels, all different angels, and tzaddikim that are, their body is definitely in the ground. They don't come down in body. They are heavenly entities now. The disembodied neshamas, angels, all these magidim. And we say that, the Arizal enjoyed, the hot tips that he got from these people also. So how does it work? At least is there a way to reconcile, at least with the hardline school of the Rambam? So here's another vintage piece from my Rebbe, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, right, who was heart and soul a Rambamist, right? And he says, as a kid to Rav Hutner, why in Makaba? Why do we accept what the Arizal said? It's all lo b'shamayim. If his source was indeed, he got a hot tip from heaven. Right. How so? And he says Rav Hutner was floored by the question. He fell into a seat. He never thought of it before. That's where I heard it. And the way I heard the story from my Rebbe, Rav Hutner did not have an answer for him. But he later found his own answer. Rav Yaakov. It's a very important thing. This goes back to what he said about Rashi ala Torah. All right. He said he derived his answer from the Hakdama of the Smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, to the Lo Sasays. I believe it's the Hakdama to the Lo Sasays. That he thought he finished the book, and that he had a dream. Pentishka, that he said, you're forgetting to count the Lo Sasay of Pentishkachas Hashem Lokecha. You should not forget God. And he says, in the morning, I woke up, I looked it up, and I realized I have to count it. which, by the way, I'm not sure the Rambam counts that, which goes back to the point, a hot tip from heaven you can argue with. But so now I would like to double check that, but I'm not sure that the Rambam counts that as a lo sase, as a separate lo sase, but the Smag does. And he says he got a hot tip, he got the dream, and he looked it up, and he saw that from the Gemara, it seems it should be counted as a lo sase. So I want to ask on the Smag, lo bashamayim he. So Rosh Yeshiva said, Yaakov Weinberg, all right, you have to read everything he says there. It says, and in the morning I got up, I looked it up, and I saw that that's the case. He said, from there we learn a principle. Even if you get a hot tip from heaven, if you do the research, you don't just rely on it and use it as your source. You do the research, and the research confirms it, it's okay. And we accept it because of the research. And that's what he says. I got up in the morning, I looked it up. Right? Yanti, I thought about it. That's the case. So he said, from that Smag, I learned a yesod. He said that if you get a hot heavenly tip, all right, you don't have to, it can't serve as the source as to why you think you're right. It can't be the source, right? It can't be the source, but you could now let me check this out. And if you do the research and it holds, so we'll accept what you say based on its academic validity. Based on its academic validity, we'll accept it, right? So you don't. The divine inspiration, the hot tip from heaven, can't be the reason why it is to be accepted as truth. But you don't have to discard that hot tip. You could go and objectively do the research, and if it holds up, we'll accept it. Why? Because of the research, because it fits, right? And we ask, well, how did you know to look for that? Well, I got a hot tip, okay, but I did the research. All right, so we accept research. We accept everything that Reese said because it works. You see it in the Zohar, right? Yeah, that's shot in Zohar. When you hear, right, it fits. It answers the questions, right? Any yesod of a Rosh Yeshiva, big yesod, right? Why do we accept it? Because it works. It fits, right? It seems to answer the questions. It seems to fit. We accept it because it works. The same thing. The Torah of the Ari, we accept, not because of the Magidim. We don't accept it because of the Magidim. We accept it because it works, right? It will answer questions. It seems to be the pshat, right? We accept it on the basis of its pure academic standing. And the hot tip doesn't automatically disqualify it. The hot tip cannot be the source or the reason, right? But if in response to the hot tip, you do the research, we accept it because of the research. Dok v'tishkach. Okay, this was uncharacteristically long. We have one more thing to resolve. We're going to continue next week because we still didn't get back to Esther. Okay, so this is the way it works. Can't shut the mind off. Sometimes ideas come and you think it can be contained within the 40 minutes. Okay, man plans, God laughs. Okay, have a great week, everybody.